Okay, so thank you very much. So today I'm going to, but I think my discussion in the echo quite a lot Professor Alice Jan's discussion, but I'm looking at it from another perspective, not from the effectiveness of the population policy, but rather on its impacts on gender equality. And this is because of my background on gender research. So today what I'm going to present is indeed a paper that I co-authored with two of my PhD students, Ms. Cai Xiaoming and Ms. Chen Lingxi, and our paper is entitled Pronatalism, China's Three-Child Policy and Gender Equality, Feminist Institutional Analysis. So I think if we want to talk about China's three-child policy, I think one thing which is the background information is really important is that China has experienced very dramatic fertility decline. In 1970, the total fertility rate in China was 5.81, but it dropped to 2.75 in 1979. And in the 1980s, the total fertility rate fluctuated above the replacement level. But since the 1990s, the total fertility rate has dropped to below the replacement level. And now the current fertility rate in China is around 1.7. So I think when we are talking about pronatalism, maybe we can also think a little bit more about what does it mean. Pronatalism refers to pro-birth ideologies, and which can manifest, for example, in individual aspirations, cultural norms, or state policies, laws, and discourses. Historically, I think we can identify three forms of pronatalism. The first one is what scholars often call coercive pronatalism, and this is often associated with far-right, very conservative family and gender norms, and also associated with racism and eugenicism. Usually, this type of policies they will want to improve or increase the birth of some specific population, but they are also anti-natalist of some other groups which are considered inferior. And then so the second type of pronatalism is what we call pronatalism and motherhood mandate. Is that often the pro-birth ideology is associated citizenship to their role as mothers. Or, for example, will link motherhood to heterosexual marriage. So, and then at the expense of single motherhood, or the motherhood of lesbian women. And the third types of pronatalism is what we call target-driven pronatalism. This means that the governments have a very clear target, and then they implement policies to increase or to meet the targets of population birth. Because of its association with racism or imperialism or eugenicism, coercive pronatalism, I think very few countries will talk about this explicitly now. And but of course, pronatalism and motherhood mandate has still remained quite common, underscoring a lot of the population policies. But most countries now have what we so-called target-driven pronatalism. But even target-driven pronatalism, they have received quite a lot of criticism recently, because a lot of the policies focus on, for example, increasing cash transfers or providing financial supports for new parents, for example, the baby bonuses in Singapore, or maternity capital in Russia, or interest-free loans in Hungary. But scholars evaluating the effectiveness of this target-driven pronatalism argue that it's not very effective and it's very costly. In most cases, they may increase, they may change the timing or the spacing of childbirth, but then in the long term, they don't increase the total number of childbirth. So since the 1990s, there's an international discussion about maybe we need to have a new paradigm on population policies. Instead of focusing on meeting a certain population targets, maybe the focus should be on reproductive empowerment. And so, for example, in the 1994 International Conference on Population and Development, the focus is really on about how do we realize and empower individuals to realize their reproductive goal on the basis of human rights, dignity, and gender equity within the context of reproductive health and rights. So I think this is a quite interesting paradigm shift from very concerned about the numbers of birth and to the really principles underscoring the policy. So in this presentation, I will adopt this the principles of this new paradigm. Okay, so this new paradigm of population policies, I think the policy goals, as I mentioned, are not about increasing a specific targets of population growth or meeting a specific target, but the broad policy goals are about enhancing reproductive health, promoting gender equality, and also safeguarding individuals, particularly children's and families' well-being. And then when the states, the governments implement policies, they usually focus on family policies. But the rationale of family policies are again not about meeting a specific population growth targets, but on the rationale of equality and child health and development. And so family policies implemented underscored by this new paradigm, they emphasize inclusiveness and gender sensitivity. So, for example, they want a policy to cater to the needs of different population groups, including the disadvantaged one and also minorities. And also about gender sensitivity, they will take into consideration existing gender inequalities in the labor markets and also in the family. And then the goals of the family policy is really about increasing equality. So a lot of the focuses of these policies are about how to, for example, reduce gender inequality in the labor market and in the family. And countries adopting this new paradigm, for example, I think Scandinavian countries in Europe, they promote a so-called dual earner and dual carer model. So this model has two broad aims. The first one is to reduce or eliminate barriers to mothers' labor market participation, and also to reduce the penalties that mothers will experience in the labor markets because of their childbirth and care responsibilities. And then the second policy goal would be to facilitate fathers' participation in childcare, so to reduce gender inequalities in unpaid work in the family. And so, for example, when they introduce parental leave, they also introduce a quota that requires fathers to take up a certain percentage of the parental leave. So when, of course, it's very difficult to really evaluate the consequence of or the impacts of a policy, not to mention because we are doing this in China, which is a huge country with, populations, a large population, and also there's a lot of rural-urban inequalities and regional differences. But when we are thinking how to evaluate the policies, we try to incorporate multi-dimensions. The first dimension is that we look at the materialistic dimensions of pronatalism in China, meaning we look at the laws and regulations implemented by the state. But we also look at the symbolic dimensions, referring to the discourses by, for example, prominent government officials or politicians. Because research in, for example, in Turkey and other countries have shown that sometimes the laws and legislations, they may not change, but because of pronatalist discourses, it actually have impacts on gender equality. For example, in Turkey, while abortion has remained legal, but because government officials and also prominent politicians, they have often talked about that abortion is against the national interest, and then so it results in a lot of local, for example, healthcare provisioners. They reduce provision for access to abortion. And so that's why we think that, in the presentation, you will see that we look at not only policies and laws, we also look at, the discourses of the state. And When we're talking about pronatalist policies, there's some direct policies, but there's also indirect policies. And we also will look at both, these two types of policies. And then finally, in terms of consequence, of course, policies will have direct consequence, but for sociologists, we also think it's really important to look at unintended consequence. For example, I will give an example of China's one-child policy. Of course, the one-child policy implemented in the 1980s, the intended consequence was reduce childbirth. But then later scholars discovered there's an unintended consequence, which is to improve women's status, especially in the urban area. So in the presentation in this paper, we also both look at consider the direct or intended consequence and then unintended consequence. So I think before we talk about China, I would like to first, for example, look at the evidence from other countries. And because coercive pronatalism, I think they have been out of date, so we don't include here. But so we look at two main types of pronatalism, target-driven pronatalism and reproductive empowerment. And also the policies, we look at direct policies and indirect policies. Target-driven pronatalism, as I just said, they usually implement two types of policies. The first one is financial support and transfer for childbirth. And the second one is the policies to restrict access to abortion and family planning. And in terms of these causes, target-driven pronatalism, they are often associated with two types of discourses. One is motherhood mandate, meaning that they often send a message to women that is their, citizenship obligation to have children to help improve the strength of the nation. And then they're often also associated with ethno-nationalism because a lot of the discussion and the discourses are really not about individuals and their well-being, but about the strength of the nation. But on the other hand, reproductive empowerment, they seldom have direct pro-birth policies, but instead they have indirect policies, which, for example, related to childcare services. They will provide comprehensive, universal, and affordable childcare services, which are publicly funded. And also they have parental leave schemes. In many countries, the parental leave schemes, they also have a father quota as to ensure that men really make use of this parental leave schemes and to actively involve and participate in childcare and to equalize domestic division of labor. And also they have universal access to reproductive and health services. And because for the reproductive empowerment, the goal is really not about meeting a population targets of childbirth. So they don't really have this, for example, motherhood mandate or ethno-nationalism. The discourses is really about gender equality, reproductive health, and also maybe other forms of equality, inclusiveness, the well-being of individuals and family. So, okay. So in our research, we adopt a feminist institutional analysis. And this, I will briefly talk about this. This is based on sociologist Sylvia Warby's book on theorizing patriarchy. In this book, Sylvia Warby argues that if we want to understand gender relationship, we have to look at not only patriarchy, but also its interaction with capitalism and racism. And even in the system of patriarchy, she differentiates 6 substructures: the mode of production, relations and pay work, the state, male violence, sexuality, and cultural productions. I think the 3 substructures are particularly relevant to our research. The first one is about gender domestic division of labor in the family. The second one is about gender inequalities in the labor market. And the third one is about gender state power and policies. And Sylvia Warby argues that a lot of social changes are really resulted from uneven changes and tension between different substructures. And I think this echo, for example, demographers like Peter McDonald's argument that fertility decline is often the result between women's increasing opportunities in education and the labor markets, and then the lagging behind of gender norms regarding their roles in the family. And so we think that this is a really insightful framework, and so we will adopt it to really analyzing how, for example, we can understand the impacts of China's three-child policy by looking at how gender norms shape state policies, labor markets, and the family, and how in turn the interactions between these two institutions shape or mediate the impacts of the three-child policy on gender equality. Okay, so I think I will talk quickly about the history of China as reproductive engineering. China implemented the one-child policy. So this is really interesting. It's anti-natalist in the 1980s. And then lots of scholars argue that this policy has a eugenic undertone because the policy emphasis is for less birth, but superior birth. So there's a lot of talk about the quality of the population. And this policy is also instrumentalist and nationalistic because its major concern is about meeting the human resources advantage of China and also to ensure China, as national strength. And this policy, when it was implemented, there's a lot of evidence of coercive enforcement because in many regions, scholars documented forced sterilization or forced abortion. And then, but even the Chinese government was forced to slowly adjust their policy because of traditional Chinese societies' strong pronatalist and son preference tendencies, especially in the rural areas. So we then later seen a lot of adjustments of the policy. For example, in rural areas, couples whose first birth is a girl, later they were allowed to have a second birth. And also, the coercive enforcement was slowly and gradually phased out. But in because of in 2013, then China have a new policy which is called Dandu two-child policy, which allows the second childbirth for couples with any spouses being a singleton. And so the early adjustments was only relevant to rural population, but now this is a universal adjustment that is relevant to all population in China. And in this policy statement, it in particular highlighted the rationales before this policy shift. There are four rationales. The first one is declining GDP growth since 2010. And then the second one is decrease of working age population and increase of aging population. And so many local governments, they also have a pension crisis. And also the continuance of a high sex ratio at birth that bias towards males. And then in 2016, then China then implement a universal two-child policy because the population decline has accelerated. But unfortunately, the outcomes of this two-child policy fell short of the official expectation about the fertility rise. So that's why we see in 2021 May, the government then implement a universal three-child policy. So if we look at about this universal, there's a typo error, it's not three-child policy. We look at the direct policies. There's a so-called guiding opinions on further improving and implementing measures for supporting active childbearing. So this focus on few aspects. The first one is, to have guidelines on childbirth leave arrangements. And then the second one is childbirth insurance, for example, to cover some of the medical causes of childbirth, and also childbirth allowances. and to urge companies to improve their breastfeeding facilities, and also urge companies and enterprise to implement family-friendly workplace policies. But we can also see that there's a lot of indirect policies. There's the law on the protection of the rights and interests of women, and also the outline for women's development in China 2021 to 2030. And I will elaborate, about actually what are the concrete policy contents of these two policies. But although these policies address, try to reduce gender inequalities in the labor markets, particularly focusing on reducing discrimination, for example, against pregnant women, but the discourse has remained quite focused on, population structure or national growth. So it has remained a very nationalist discourse rather than, focusing more on gender equality. Okay, so there's a lot of concern after the government implement this or announce this policy. There's a lot of public concerns about how this policy will impact on women's reproductive autonomy. Because of the legacy of the one-child policy, access to legal and affordable and high-quality abortion services and family planning services in China have been implemented and for example, these services are provided by public hospitals, private hospitals, and even NGOs. But there's a widespread concern that whether the state will tighten or restrict women's access to abortion and contraception. We already see a little bit of this happening. For example, in the implementation of the three-child policy, there's already inclusion of provisions to reduce abortions that are not medically necessary. And so this is the first sign that a lot of people are worrying. The second aspect is that even after the implementation of the two-child policy, scholars have already observed that women, they face increased fertility pressure, for example, among those who have less desire for a second childbirth, and also increased fertility anxiety for those who do wish to have a one. And scholars also, argue that a lot of the pressure and anxiety that Chinese women face after the implementation of the two-child policy is related to a combination of so-called Confucian patriarchy, which has remained positioning women's dominant role within the family and their, obligation as mothers, and so-called state patriarchy, which defines women's citizenship to their, motherhood. And we can see that there's a lot of discourses, which is, making scholars concerned about this or the public concern. For example, fertility decline in China has been framed as women's problems. There's intensified blame on women without intention for marriage or without intention to have more children. I know there's a popular, some, for example, state media blame women for being selfish. And also state media urge local governments to promote the so-called greatness of reproduction and motherhood and to reduce exaggerated accounts of reproductive anxiety. And also in some areas, there's already online censorship. Some online forums where women express unwillingness to get married or to give birth have already been censored since 2021. Now, let's quickly look at the potential impact of three-child policy on gender inequalities in the labor markets. We all know that gender equality is a basic national policy in China, which is enshrined in the constitution. And the Chinese government also have, implemented laws, for example, the labor protection regulations, the labor law, and special rules on the labor protection for female employees. Sorry, I think apparently my time is just being very quick. Okay. But we also have observed that since the economic reforms, China's the gender equality in the labor market, the statistics from China are quite different from the global trend. For example, we observe, declining female labor force participation in China from the 1990s to 2019. We also observe the widening gender wage gap in China, that the gap is particularly pronounced in rural areas. Okay, so why, for example, when gender equality is enshrined in the constitutions, and when there's different types of laws to protect gender equality or women's rights in the labor markets, we have still witnessed persistent workplace gender discrimination and inequalities. Scholars argue that this is because China lacks particular ordinances or lacks specific definitions about discriminatory practices. And there's also often ineffective enforcement, and because there's no specific mechanisms or institutional setups to enforce all the guidelines. So in some, a lot of the talks or states' positions about gender equality, they exist in the forms of very general guidelines without the specifics for implementations. So that's why scholars observe a huge gap between the state's policy or its goal for gender equality and local implementation. For example, after the two-child policy, some companies even set up so-called pregnancy queue, meaning to limit the number of pregnant workers in a given time. And this really increased female employees' anxiety about the impacts of their childbirth will have on their career. We are quite concerned about the further impacts of three-child policy on gender inequalities in the labor market, because it may change employers' expectation. Employers may anticipate higher costs for human capital development or the human capital development of female employees because of this three-child policy. It may also shape employees' choices. Women who anticipate second or third childbirth may then intentionally choose jobs which are lower pay and with lower prospects, but give them more flexibilities. And we are also quite concerned about whether this three-child policy will widen inequalities between state and non-state sectors, and also widen regional inequalities with respect to women's labor force participation rates and labor market attainments. Finally, I will say a little bit about three-child policy and gender inequalities in the family. What I would say would just echo what Professor Alice Zhang has presented. So although China's situation may be slightly better than other East Asian countries in terms of men's participation in domestic work, but I think domestic work, especially care work, has remained, a very feminist type of work with the burden that falls disproportionately on the shoulders of women. In Chinese societies, family usually have three types of childcare support. One is generational based, which with grandparenting, that is, filling the childcare gap. The second one is state support, but this has witnessed a lot of decline because after the economic reform, there's a privatization, and then state is withdrawing slowly from public childcare support. And so in the place of the state withdrawal, then we have seen increase in market provisions, but these are often costly and their safety and quality raises a lot of concerns. Okay, so I think if we want to understand how the three-child policy will impact on gender equalities in the family, I think we have also need to look at how Chinese families have changed. Anthropologist Yang Yanchan argues that the Chinese families have changed a lot since the economic reform and towards what he identifies as neo-feminism. And neo-feminism, according to Professor Yang, has four characteristics. One is called descending feminism, in meaning it's becoming really child-centered. And of course, then this will place increasing demands on, parenting, especially on intensive mothering. The second one is about there's an intimate turn. So there's a lot of emphasis on emotional bonding among family members, and this also may increase the emotional care work, and and also it particularly will influence mothers. The third one is about materialism. Increasingly, Chinese families' esteem and reputation is defined by its ability to accumulate wealth, and this has led to overworking of fathers to make money, and of course, then this may possibly reduce paternal involvement in childcare. And then the fourth aspect, which we found really interesting, is about intensified tension between individual and family interests. As I say, although the state has emphasis a lot about women's citizenship as mothers, but then we also witness a lot of younger generation women protesting against the state's ideology, and also women resisting the pressure from their husbands and in-laws to have more children. And I guess this is because Chinese women also their educational attainments increased quite dramatically since the 1990s because of huge and rapid expansion of the higher education. Okay, so I think I will conclude my presentation here is that I think it's still premature to really conclude what the implications of China's free child policy on, for example, women's reproductive autonomy and gender inequalities in the labor markets and in the family. But I think overall, I think it would be very productive if we have adopt an institutional analysis that will look at, for example, how culture norms shape the major institutions, and how these major institutions, for example, the state, the markets, and the family interacts, then mediate the impacts of the three-child policy on gender equality. So thank you so much, and I apologize for overrunning a little bit.
Question or comment to the last presentation, Professor Choi. So yeah, the Chinese case is very interesting. And just one thought that came to my mind was that probably the reason the government is using this, in some sense, kind of old style, old school kind of nationalist kind of language in promoting fertility is partly due to maybe budget constraint, because to provide child care services and promoting parental leaves and so forth and so forth. So all kinds of welfare policies, child care policies need a lot of money basically. But to my understanding, Chinese welfare state has been expanding continuously, but I don't know, it is still not there yet to meet all the needs, the needs of mothers and families. So in order to make up for that, they are relying on these kind of old ideology or paradigms, or family paradigms, or nationalist languages in order to make up for the lack of budget. So I think in some sense it is their kind of strategic, I don't know, choice. What do you think?
I think this is really interesting. And I think it will not just really about China, it will also about a lot of middle income countries, because we have seen, for example, middle income countries like Russia or Turkey or countries like Iran, and they all resort to using nationalist rhetorics to push or to give women pressure to have more children. And one of the reasons maybe is really budgetary constraints, but I also think it's really about the political culture as well. These countries, for example, China has been quite nationalistic, and even after the economic reform, and in particular in the last 10 years, the so-called China dream and all this is really a very nationalistic discourse. So it could be about budgetary constraints, but it also could be echoing, the overall political culture. But I think my concern, our concern as feminist scholars, is really about the marginalization of gender equality or individual human rights discourses in the national discourses. Because I think, as I know I presented, we are quite concerned about how this three-child policy will limit or restrict women's reproductive autonomy. Also, given that China has a history of coercive enforcement of population policies, and also given its political structure is yeah, we will be quite concerned about this.